My husband Jason and I were married shortly before we left, so that we could go into the Peace Corps and go have this wonderful adventure that we just had.
I'm getting there.
We're getting there? Should I keep talking?
Yes.
Okay. Now I have to start making things up because there's supposed to be a slideshow. That's not working right now. We left 2 years ago to join the Peace Corps. Yes, we have the Peace Corps. No, we don't.
Or patient.
I'll do the lights. You just stay there.
No, maybe? Alright, I'm going to start talking, and hopefully this thing will work. If not, we'll just talk, and there won't be nearly as many interesting things to look at. So, I'm assuming that basically everybody here knows what the Peace Corps is, because it's a bunch of Unitarians. But to do a brief overview and a brief history, John F. Kennedy established the Peace Corps on March 1st, 1961 by Executive Order 10924. The first group of volunteers left for Ghana on August 30th of that year. Since then, there have been about 210,000 volunteers who have served, and there's currently about 8,000 volunteers serving. I think there's 8,073 according to the most recent statistics.
Maybe we'll just do
How many?
There's
Say that again.
currently serving 8,073. And so within the first 5 years of Peace Corps, it went from this group of 20-some volunteers in Ghana to 14,500 volunteers in 55 countries. Since then, there's been 139 countries served by Peace Corps. The map on the wall over there, all of the places that are dark brown have had or currently have Peace Corps volunteers. So it's basically most of the world, which is kind of awesome.
Poor Canada.
I know.
Poor Canada.
Australia and New Zealand too are missing out.
Yeah.
Greece.
Okay. We already went over that slide. Okay. Go.
Okay, so what does the Peace Corps look like today? So today most volunteers still serve in Africa, which is kind of what you expect, about 43%. Where we served in the Pacific Islands is only about 3% of current volunteers. Most volunteers are education workers, with health bringing up a pretty sizable chunk of the rest. Some of the more interesting statistics are what does an average Peace Corps volunteer look like? Most Peace Corps volunteers are female, 63%. I think in Vanuatu that's closer to 70% are females. Almost all volunteers are single. 93% of volunteers are single versus only 7% married. 22% of volunteers are minority. And then over 50 volunteers is about 7% of Peace Corps. We actually had a number of over 50 volunteers in our group, including one who had actually done Peace Corps in his 20s and was back for a second tour. The average age of a Peace Corps volunteer is 28.
So there are three, somewhere in the history of Peace Corps, I couldn't figure out when, the Peace Corps put together a mission statement with 3 goals. The first goal is the obvious one for Peace Corps: helping the people of interested countries in meeting their needs for trained men and women. This is where we talk about capacity building, about teaching. It's sort of the work part of Peace Corps. Yeah. So goal 2 is where we start to get into the touchy-feely hippie stuff. Helping promote a better understanding of Americans on the part of the people served. For instance, Halloween. Halloween is great fun. And most of those jack-o'-lanterns are made out of green papaya, not out of pumpkins.
There's one, the big one.
That one's a pumpkin. The rest of those are green papaya. And then the last part is helping promote a better understanding of other peoples on the part of Americans. So we kind of consider this to have parts A and B. Part A is where we learn, and part B is where we do things like this. So for us, learning, for Jason, learning involved taking his pants off.
It's the traditional dress of the area where we were, and that's my chief that I'm standing next to.
Blue. I'll come. You know,
It's
like
the
white.
It was
piece
the
of
only
cloth
color.
that I had.
So I wrote up this nice little thing about why is the Peace Corps important. The goals give us a nice tidy package of what the Peace Corps does, but it doesn't explain to me why it's important. Clearly the country served benefit, or at least that should be clear. The personal importance is a personal thing. Each volunteer I know has gone for a different reason and stayed for different ones. But from the point of view of our society, sending Americans to other countries to spend 2 years living in a hut in the bush, or sharing a room in a family's house, or sleeping with rats in teachers' housing at a boarding school is important. It gives a slice of each generation a wider worldview and helps us to achieve a truly global perspective as citizens. It gives us an emotional depth and maturity we, as Americans, lack. It teaches us to fail, despite hard work and following our dreams, and then teaches us to get up and try again. Most importantly, it teaches us to connect with people on the common level of humanity and build our relations up from there. Instead of breaking ourselves into groups of us and them, based on irrelevant or minor distinctions like race and religion and politics and gender, it teaches us to come together as the common human theme and build our relationships from that point. Yeah. So, having said all of that, all those nice pretty words, I want to know if everybody could just think of one word that to you is what Peace Corps is. When you hear Peace Corps, what's the first word that comes to mind?
Peace.
Oh, there's good start.
Understanding.
Understanding?
Humanity.
Humanity?
Service.
Service?
Yeah, service.
How fast can you type, Jason?
Rather fast.
Optimism.
Optimism?
A different image.
Learning.
What about if you think of a Peace Corps volunteer?
Who do you think of when you think of a Peace Corps volunteer?
Idealistic.
Idealistic. I agree with that one.
Having been there.
That's who knows.
Adventurous.
Adventure.
Open.
Gutsy.
Yeah.
Humanist.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Unselfish.
Learn.
Unselfish.
Yeah.
We good? Okay. So we wanted to kind of make a list because these are the expectations that we feel going into it. This is what our community is telling us we should be. The expectations of a Peace Corps volunteer are interesting. As we were going into it, we had our own expectations of what Peace Corps service would be, and we had the expectations of our community of what they expected us to be doing, and the expectations of what our host country expected us to be. Which, all of those expectations, sometimes they were good, and sometimes they were maybe not so accurate. So these are some of the words that we came up with. Some of them may be a bit tongue-in-cheek, like CIA. We are not CIA agents, despite what all the hype says. But
Would you tell us if you were?
probably not. But maybe just for you, Mike. So the expectations that I felt coming in were that we would be young, single, college-educated, idealistic, white, straight. These are all things that the mental image of a Peace Corps volunteer kind of springs to mind. The reality is rather different. To start with, Jason and I are married. That alone made people look at us like, what are you guys joining the Peace Corps for? Like, what are you doing? Yeah, we had a conflict between our community here saying, atheists join the Peace Corps, or maybe humanists, because we're in a Unitarian church at the moment.
One of the more religious volunteers in our group actually commented to us that when he was telling his friends that he was going to join the Peace Corps, the reaction he would get was, "Why are you joining that atheist organization?"
Interesting.
But on the other side of that, most of the people in the host country expect us to be religious. A lot of the volunteers they get are missionaries. And the country is very religious, so they kind of expect people to be religious, just point blank.
So we had a conflict between what was expected of us and what we expected and what the reality was. Another good conflict is, you think Peace Corps, you think mud hut in Africa, right? And then you find out that Jason's teaching computers. Run that one through your head a couple times. Turns out there's electricity in the mud hut.
On
So-
good days.
On good days.
Sometimes.
So we had all of these expectations of what Peace Corps was going to be. And this is more about what our experience actually was. So to start with,
So, where is Vanuatu? I think the best reaction we got when we told people we were going to Vanuatu is, bless you. If you look very carefully in the South Pacific, you'll see there's a bunch of dots there. We were on one of those. Down here, this is Fiji right here. And so we're in that kind of area, getting a little bit closer. You can see it's about halfway between Fiji and Australia. And this is the country we're on. The little pin is on Pentecost Island. We've got a bigger map of it off to the side there. And we're about in the middle for our service. So,
80.
right there.
yep, just got it. So, Vanuatu, it's how it's pronounced. There are 82 islands, 65 of which are inhabited. Primarily about a dozen, 10 or 12 main islands that make up the bulk of the population. The total area is about the size of Maryland. And if you're looking at just the landmass, about Rhode Island. So it's a very small country. The population is about 260,000. And in the capital city, Port Vila, where we're living now, having completed our 2-year service on the island, we moved into the capital. There's about 35,000 people. The second biggest city, Luganville, up on Santo in the north of the country, there are 13,000. And then there's a third municipality down on Tana in the south called Linikal, which has about 1,000 at most. Most people do live on the outer islands and are primarily subsistence farmers. When I say subsistence, you normally think of like South America kind of scraping by. In Vanuatu, the way you plant things is you cut off a chunk of the stem and stick it in the ground. It's the most fertile place that I've ever seen. So subsistence farming actually gets by fairly well. And we'll be talking about in a minute, you actually like grow your house. So there's very little desperation in the country, which has its benefits and disadvantages as well. There's basically no exports. There's a little bit of copra, which is a piece of the coconut, sometimes used in biodiesel, that they do export. Kava is the drink intoxicant of choice. And some of that gets exported. It is legal in the US. The EU has banned it, but they banned it because there's not enough research on it, not because it actually does anything really detrimental. There are actually 7 kava bars in the US. I haven't made it to one. There's none in Minnesota.
We'll fix that.
We can work on that. Most of the money that travels around the country is people selling kava or copra into the main islands, the 2 main cities. And most of the money coming into the country from outside is tourism or foreign aid. Foreign aid, I believe, makes up about 60% of the budget of Vanuatu. When we're talking foreign aid, we're talking mostly Australia, New Zealand. China's a fairly big one, and then US and EU make up the last little bit. Tourism, there's a lot of cruise ships that come through. The capital sees about 4 or 5 a week. Now, when we first got there 2 years ago, it was seeing about 2 a week. So it's actually going up quite a bit. Couple of the big tourist draws in the country is Yasur Volcano down on Tana. It is one of the most active volcanoes in the world. You can walk right up to the rim and watch it explode every about 10 minutes. All the explosions come right back down to the cauldron, so that's why you can actually go up to it. Well, yeah, every once in a while they raise it to, it gets a little more active and then you're not allowed on it, especially if you're a Peace Corps volunteer. One of the other big ones is Pentecost, the island where we were, where there's a custom called land diving. They build a tower out of sticks, tie vines to their legs, and jump off. They do break up the ground a little bit. The vines are supposed to hold them, like bring them to a stop just before they get to the ground, and then they come back and land nicely. Most of the time. So, we were sent there to do a job. My primary responsibility was teaching basic computing skills to year 9 and 10 students at LCC College. It's a French school. I taught in the Bislama. I missed out on the last slide. There's the three official languages of the country are English, French, and Bislama. The country was jointly controlled by France and England. It worked about as well as you'd expect. And Bislama is the trade language. Basically, Bislama is to English what Creole is to French. So I would say by the end of 2 years, we're both probably fluent in Bislama. The reason the trade language is the big one is there are over 110 local languages spoken throughout the country.
Wow.
So we picked up little.
2,000 speakers per language.
Yeah. So we picked up a little bit of the local language, enough to say, good morning, where are you going, are you drinking kava? That's about it.
Shut up now.
and shut up, foul. That's another important one. So my primary work was teaching basic computing skills to years 9 and 10 students. I also did some classes that were open to community, so that anybody who was interested could come learn basic computing skills. And then I also ran some workshops for some workers of a NGO in the area, so that they could more effectively do their work for their NGO and do their reporting and all that kind of stuff.
As was previously mentioned, I was a health volunteer, and my job description consisted of improve the health in your area. Excuse me. So I had 2 major focuses. My first one was hygiene and sanitation. I ran the participatory hygiene and sanitation transformation workshops, which is a WHO-supported tool to get communities involved in their own hygiene and sanitation situations. In some cases, that meant I did a lot of these pictures. The literacy rate in Vanuatu is about 26%, and in our area is about 11%. So we're talking of basically a literate population. We worked a lot with pictures. Probably get background music. Isn't that nice? So I ran these workshops where I spent the time with pictures of different hygiene and sanitation situations, everything from open defecation through to a good toilet, or maybe somebody who's preparing food in the same place that they use the bathroom, going through to washing hands before you eat every time. And I gave people the opportunity to discuss their own hygiene and sanitation situations in their communities. Out of that, we decided to write a grant asking for money to build toilets in the community that had attached bathhouses in them, which would be a drastic improvement, because right now everybody is using pit toilets or open defecation, and there are no bathhouses. They joke that, when it's time to swim, they wait for dark.
Yeah.
So we got funding for that the week I left site, and I'm hoping the volunteer who replaces me will be taking that over.
Your primary health issues are?
In my area, the primary health issues are around hygiene and sanitation. There's huge rates of diarrhea. There's also a fairly high issue with right now, like kind of an up-and-coming issue right now with diabetes and obesity.
Oh, yeah.
The South Pacific people are used to surviving on a kind of a minimum diet. So when things like rice and sugar got introduced, there's been an explosion of obesity and a consequent explosion of diabetes. There's also a very hard push right now towards maternal and child health. The maternal mortality rate is still fairly high, as is the infant mortality rate. And vaccinations have made a huge dent in that. In the past 10 or 15 years, they've actually started getting about 50% of the population vaccinated, which has done wonders for the early childhood mortality rate, but that's still only 50% of the population, so we could work to improve that yet.
Clean water is one of the important things on sanitation, and what do they do for their water supply?
In our area, they took it from the bush, so it was a piped water supply that was a gravity-fed system. We were basically on the side of a mountain, right? I mean, imagine a bunch of mountain peaks sticking out of the water, and we were on the tops of those mountain peaks. So there's enough of a hill going there that if the water tank is at the top, it provides the pressure for the water to come out. And up at the top of the hill, there's very low population, so there's a lot less contamination of the water sources there. We drank the water in our community without filtering it for 2 years, and I think we got sick off of it once or twice, but we might have gotten sick off of any number of other things too, I don't know.
The source of the water is
Ground source. Although there are a lot of islands in Vanuatu that don't have a clean water source, like a non-salinated water source, and those places all use rainwater catchment. A lot of tin roofs with a rain barrel under it, which then, provides a problem because you have a mosquito place and then you have more malaria.
Yeah.
What kind of animal life do you have on that island?
There's almost no mammals. The mammals were almost exclusively introduced by humans at some stage or another. There's cows, pigs, dogs, cats, and rats. The only native animal is a giant bat that we call a flying fox.
Oh.
They're about this big. They're really cool looking. And otherwise, it's all birds, lizards, insects. I saw more lizards in the last 2 years than I ever thought I would see in my life. They're kind of cute. Okay, so primary work was hygiene and sanitation. And then my other major thing that I did was help in the school that Jason was teaching in, teaching sexual and reproductive health. Turns out I am my father's daughter. This is another, when you're talking about up-and-coming issues in the South Pacific, the STI rate in Vanuatu is something like 60%. Yeah, we tell people 2 out of 3. 2 out of 3 people already have an STI. So AIDS hasn't really gotten to Vanuatu yet, according to the official numbers. I think that AIDS has gotten to Vanuatu, but we don't have testing centers. There's a testing center in the capital city, and there's a testing center in the other city. And there's no other places that they can get tested. And there are plenty of people who never leave their island in their lifetime. Where are they going to get tested? So they opened a 3rd testing center in the last month we were there, and 2 new AIDS cases have magically cropped up in the statistics. So this is why I consider the sexual and reproductive health thing a really important topic to talk about. It's totally taboo to talk about it. There's huge, you never mention this. Girls don't know why they suddenly start bleeding. They think they're dying. And so when I came up and said, no, this is menstruation, it means you can have babies now, they were like, oh. So I consider this really important work.
Their mothers never teach them that?
No. It's completely taboo to talk about it. So then the last chunk of work that I really pushed hard on was doing workshops with other NGOs. So working with other organizations to try to increase the capacity of their service providers. Jason talked about some of the workshops he did for computers. I did the same things, but usually around nutrition or sex ed.
Are contraceptives taboo too, or?
For a really Catholic area, my priest, so I went to the priest and said, hey, I want to start teaching about HIV and STIs. And he said, make sure you tell them about condoms. I said, you win. Not taboo, but in some places they're discouraged because you need a big family to work your garden. And having a big family is considered a good thing. I think that this is also partially a generational thing. The people who are my parents and my grandparents' generation generally had 5, 6, 7 siblings. But now the people in my generation are looking at more like 4 to 5 siblings, and the people in my generation are saying, I think 2's good. Well, we're good there. There's also, I noticed, an entertaining gender gap on that, of the boys want 4 and the girls want 2.
Yeah.
Go. Doesn't want to go. He just wants you to go. Oh, wait, I have the next slide.
All right.
Okay. So that was the jobs that we were sent there to do, and then there's the difference between what we were sent there to do and what we actually did. Some of the other things that I actually did was teaching, the top right picture is teaching sex ed to other service providers. I mentioned that a little bit. I spent a lot of time doing this, and it was one of the more rewarding things I did. I found that if I went to the service providers and taught them, they were more engaged, they were more animated, and I know that they're going to go and take that information and pass it along. And that to me is the whole reason I'm there. I'm not there to be the only teacher, I'm there to teach people so that they can do the teaching to their own communities. The other thing I did on this bottom corner, I collaborated with a group of other Peace Corps volunteers to try to adapt a toolkit talking about hygiene and sanitation for kids between 2nd grade and 6th grade. So we created a toolkit that included like a memory game where the 2 matching cards that you have to flip over are a good hygiene behavior and its bad counterpart, like washing your hands before you eat and eating with dirty hands, things like that. So we adapted this toolkit that's already in use in Somalia and parts of Central America.
Were there any songs used? I know they use that to teach.
And puppets.
And puppets. That was really what got me hooked on it, was puppets. The other thing that we kind of jointly did as an accidental side project was starting a demonstration garden. We were hungry. We wanted to eat more food. So we started planting the foods that we were excited about eating in our front yard. They fenced in the area around our house to keep the cows out. And I started planting things like pumpkins and kumalo, which is like a sweet potato, and cabbage. And all of a sudden people were like, so you don't have to walk to the garden, do you? No. Where's the fence? So by the time we left, we had 4 or 5 other people in the community who had built little gardens close to their house. Otherwise they have to walk about an hour to get to the garden. And they aren't going to do that every day. So if they walk to the garden and get food and then they run out of, say, green food, they're just eating boiled bananas or boiled starch for a couple of days until they go back to the garden. So I think this accidental demonstration garden we started will actually have a significant impact on the nutrition of the village. Yeah.
And the other picture here, we don't have a really good picture of me actually running the workshop, but another volunteer who's an accountant developed a financial literacy workshop that I then piloted and been helping develop further for giving to other volunteers throughout the country to increase the financial literacy. Because that's a big problem. They subsistence farming, so they have their basic needs covered, but any money they earn, they don't really have a concept of saving and how to budget appropriately.
Excuse me, what currency do they use?
They use the Vanuatu.
It's called Vanuatu. We have some coins. We didn't bring any of the bills. It's about 100 Vanuatu to $1. And prices are fairly similar to what you pay here. Of course, they're making a lot less.
Were seeds available to buy for
Yes,
planting?
you can get seeds to plant stuff. That's where we planted a lot of our stuff from. The stuff that wasn't growing in the gardens and we just put in ours. We did buy seeds in the capital. Some of the other stuff that we worked on was a lot of empowerment stuff. I teach martial arts. Gaea also practices and helped me teach. We had a club that we would go to. Basically, we hiked up a mountain for an hour and a half and then did a all-day seminar to work on self-confidence and also talking about appropriate use of violence. Domestic violence, especially in our area, was not whether you hit your wife, it was how hard. And part of that is they just don't know how else to interact with each other. The genders are very separated. So in that, I was very careful about who I would teach and had to have a conversation with people before I would even start teaching. And then part of the training was, why are we training? It's not to be better at hurting people. It's to build our confidence, to protect our families if we need, ourselves and our families if we need to, but more to build confidence and that kind of thing. The other part of this is the picture on the left here is a camp, a youth leadership development camp that actually Peace Corps kind of worldwide does, but there's a committee in each country that'll work on specific issues in the country. It's called Camp Glow, Camp Build, Girls Leading Our World and Boys in Leadership Development. And we've both been fairly involved with these camps, going to some of the training of trainers. We ran a couple of camps in our area, including at my school. And I feel like I connected more with the kids and pass them more in, like, increase their capacity for everyday life more in those 2 days than I had in the 2 years that I was teaching them computers. I can't say enough good about these camps. It talks about leadership in terms of communication and public speaking kind of stuff. Also talks about sexual reproductive health and decision making and general life skills. The most important thing we did, I think we both agree, is the conversations we had with people. You can give a workshop and you can talk about these things, but really when somebody comes to you and asks you a specific question that they're dealing with in their life, and you have a conversation about it, or even when you're just storing with your friend, you end up talking about things, and I think those have actually the biggest impact that we had was just through conversations with people.
One-on-one.
So a lot of these one-on-one conversations revolved around some of the touchier topics. Things like sexual and reproductive health came up a lot. Jason would be sitting there drinking kava with the guys in Nakamal, and they'd be like, so condoms, tell me about this. How do they work? Or I'd be, hanging out at my house, and all of a sudden Jason's sister comes up to the house and is like, Jason, I think you should go see my papa. Gaea, tell me about birth control. And then that actually happened. So these one-on-one conversations also gave us a really great opportunity to talk about the really hard topics, like, as Jason said, domestic violence. As a married couple, we had a unique opportunity. There we go. So we had a unique opportunity. That's Vanuatu Gothic, anyone? A lot of volunteers face domestic violence issues while they're in service. It's domestic violence, think about your generation growing up. How much awareness was there while you were growing up? What was the common practices? So this is something that's only becoming big in the world now. And a lot of volunteers then go to these countries and think, how is this possible? How is this allowed? And we try to speak out about it. And very often other volunteers face the criticism of, you're not married, you don't understand. How do you respond to that? If you're not married, you can't say, I know there's a better way, even if you do, because nobody will listen. Jason and I were in a very unique position in that. When people said, you're not married, you don't understand. Oh no, we're married and we do understand, and we still don't get each other. So we spend a lot of time modeling a good relationship, and a lot of time talking about conflict resolution and relationships and a different way. Not even necessarily saying this way is better or you have to do it this way, but just saying like, look, we're friends. We like each other, which is unusual in Vanuatu because the gender gap there is like the size of the Grand Canyon. It's the men go to the garden in the morning, they get up in the morning, they eat their breakfast, they go out to the garden. The women spend the day cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids, working around the house. The men come back from the garden, they drop off the food, they take the kava that they pulled, they bring it up to the Nakamal, which is like the boys club, and they get stoned on kava. They come back when they're too stoned to see straight. They eat their dinner and they go to bed. They usually don't come back before the women and the children are even asleep. So the interaction between the men and the women on a day-to-day basis is very minimal. Jason and I walking around together and doing things like just goofing off together and going to the garden and things like that was strange. But it was also a really great chance for us to model a different kind of relationship and to show that there's a different way of living if you are interested. That's all you.
This one is definitely me. So this is kava. We've mentioned it a couple of times. It's the drink of choice in Vanuatu. It's the root of a plant, which you see in the lower right-hand corner there. If you want to see the plant, they apparently have some at the conservatory over in by the Como Zoo. Unfortunately, you can't see the root, which is the important part. So you take the way you make kava is you take the root, which I have here, cut it up into small pieces, and then you can see me grinding it with a piece of coral, kind of like you make a mortar and pestle with it. You grind it into a paste, add a little bit of water, strain it through, juice it through a cloth, and then strain it through a piece of. It's almost like a coffee filter kind of thing that grows on the coconut tree, and then drink it. It tastes about like mud that you've put a bit of pepper in. So you take it like a shot out of half of a coconut shell. The effect is you get a little buzz, and it's really just kind of mellowing. You just kind of want to hang out and chat with the people you're with. You feel positive about everything. It's just kind of like, hey.
Oh, it's not fermented.
No, it is not fermented.
Oh, so it's a drug that you're taking there.
Kind of. It's in the pepper family.
Oh, pepper.
It's not an opiate. It's not any of that. It's in the pepper family. It's got a little bit of a topical anesthetic kind of quality to it. It makes your mouth numb when you drink it.
Tastes like shit.
It does, in fact.
So this is what the guys do basically every night. I would drink on the island. I would drink probably 4 or 5 nights a week because that's where you.
That's where the boys are
That's
at.
where the boys are.
So if you drink enough of it, then you can get pretty high.
Oh yeah.
Do they ever
So
fall down or pass out or?
it makes you really sleepy. So if they get to that point of sleepy, they usually just sleep in the Nakamal.
Could you bring back some samples?
We did, but we didn't think church was the appropriate place for it.
It's also more of a unique thing.
Yeah. So while Jason was busy getting stoned in the Nakamal, I learned how to weave. I think he won that game. But that's okay, I have a useful skill that I'll never be able to employ in this country. Weaving baskets is a really big part of Pentecost. When you get good at it, they can weave really beautiful things. They never let me play with color. I wasn't that good. But they do it out of these leaves that are called pandanus leaves. The pandanus tree looks like something that Dr. Seuss drew. They're really cool looking, but they don't look normal. And so sometimes they weave the baskets and the mats like that out of pandanus, but they also weave kind of day-to-day quick-use baskets out of coconut leaves, which is amazing. You're sitting there and you're like, oh, how am I going to get this food home? And somebody walks over to a coconut tree and 5 minutes later there's a basket. You're like, what just happened? So the mats, like this one, they have a lot of custom value, like traditional, they call it traditional money, which they say like custom money. Making them is this rather long process. First they weave these long mats. There's 2 kinds, there's the small ones like this and then there's much bigger ones. So they weave the mats, the big ones take maybe 3 women about a month to weave, and one of these would take a skilled weaver maybe a week to weave. They weave them, they soak them in the salt water, they take them out, they dry them in the sun, they soak them in salt water, they dry them in the sun, they soak them in a river, they hit them with a certain leaf, they dry them in the sun, they soak them in the salt water, and then they get to dye them. So to dye them, they cut banana skin, not like the skin of the fruit, but the skin of like the bark. They carve that into patterns, and they wrap the white mat around a piece of bamboo that's about that thick, covering it with the dye, which is the bark of a root of a vine. Don't ask me how they discovered that one. But they cover it with the dye, and then they wrap these banana skins around it. Everywhere that the banana skin is touching, the dye won't take. So it's like a negative space kind of batiking style thing. They boil it in these giant saucepans for about an hour. So each mat needs to be boiled for about an hour. And then when they come out, they're these gorgeous, brilliant red mats. The big mats like that, you need, oops, oh well. Okay, so the big mats like that get used for all kinds of custom. Do you have any funerals?
Yeah, sure. So one of the big things they use it for is funerals. When somebody dies, the family gathers together around the body and they basically hold a vigil. The family will stay in there for about a day, and everybody else, the extended family, the community will come in and kind of cry in shifts. And when I say cry, it's the purest sound of mourning I could imagine. It's a keening wail. And when I walked into the room the first time I heard this, like the hairs on my entire body stood on end. But they hold this vigil, and then the next day, as it's getting to sunset, since we're in a very Catholic area, the priest will give a mass, and then I'm not Catholic, I can't think of the word. Talk is what we'd say, but that's Islam. So the priest gives the mass, and then they bury the body in the red mats. They wrap it in multiple layers of red mats, and everybody who's coming, every family who's coming to cry brings a red mat. and then they bury it and throw in cloth and plant flowers in the grave. While the funeral is going on, they also do a feast for the village. They kill a pig or a cow and do it in a kind of pit cooking style. And then there's also a large amount of kava consumed. You can see me cutting kava up there. Behind me is a pile, if I were to lay down on the ground, about as big as I am. And you drink, for a funeral, you drink, especially the family will drink every night for 5-10 nights in a row, and drink in pretty high quantity too.
So the other main use for red mats is in getting married. Before a woman or a man can get married, they have to share red mats with their family. So the woman's family gives the mom, so the mother of the bride and groom, asks her family for mats that are then given to the father's family. Does that make sense? One of my good friends got married in the last month we were there. That heap of mats in the corner is taller than I am. She gave away 106 mats before she could get married. And if you think each of these mats takes about a month to make, if we were to put that in US dollars, they charge 3,000 Vanuatu, which is about $30 for each mat. In a society that doesn't use money, it doesn't quite make sense, but you kind of get the idea of, you're looking at well over $1,000 in mats for somebody who doesn't make money.
How are the marriages arranged? I mean, you said the women and the men don't.
Some of them are arranged marriages. Traditionally, they are arranged marriages. More commonly now, they do what's called creeping. It sounds about as lovely as it is. The man will come to the woman's house, like a young man who's interested in a boy will come to the house and scratch on the screen in the middle of the night, or sing out, whisper at the woman until she wakes up, and if she's interested, she goes outside and meets him, and then whenever they get caught, they get married. It's a really great system. That's also part of the reason we talked a lot about sexual and reproductive health, to say, maybe there's more to choosing a mate than whoever scratched at your screen first. So after they do all of this custom around paying to get married, they go and they get married, and they have a proper Catholic wedding in a church with bridal gowns and flower girls, and it's the same wedding dress for every person who's married in that church. Unless there's 2 or 3 marriages going on at once, and then they borrow from the neighboring churches. It's good enough. So after the wedding, they also incorporate a lot of really interesting custom into the church itself. This image is taken in church, and part of it is that the aunts of the woman cover themselves in this mat during the ceremony. I never got a clear explanation as to why that was happening, but meh. And then afterward, the woman goes back to her village. She's in her village for a while, and then the family of the boy comes and claims her and brings her to their village, which causes this long, drawn-out traditional ceremony of barate, which is the most obscene innuendo and dirty jokes you have ever experienced in your life. It's really fun, and I didn't need to speak language to understand what was being said. But it was really quite shocking the first time I was there. Here's this very repressed culture that never says anything about sex, nothing about menstruation, nothing, no. Conolinguist, fellatio, no. And then all of a sudden they're sticking lollipops in people's mouths and falling face first into lap, and I was like, excuse me? So that's another volunteer. Shortly after, while we were sitting there, somebody had just walked up to her and said, "Open your mouth, here's a lollipop." And then the whole custom is like a party. It's so much fun. The women are dancing and singing. I mean, they pick each other up and dance around in circles. They act like chickens at one point. I never got that why that was either.
So the sexual, is this to teach the bride about sex before she goes off to
That's
the
what
other
they tell me. If I was living that way, I'd be pretty traumatized. This video is shot directly after the First Communion. So I said the Catholic Church does a good job of incorporating stuff. In the last month we were at site, there was a First Communion, and as you can see, Jason's back in the back of this video. So we danced custom for The dancing started about 2 in the afternoon and ran well into the night. It was like 8 or so at night before we finally finished. It was fun.
Are there much forests? Looks like it's pretty.
It's a pretty dense jungle, but this is in the this is right next to the church. You can see the cross in the background.
Question?
Yep.
Is it patrilineal, matrilineal? Who owns the property? Does it stay?
Men, it's all definitely
Except-
patrilineal.
Family names.
Except family members. There's a whole,
So the when you decide how you're going to call somebody, like
oh,
if I am talking to my mom's sister, I would call her mama. If I'm talking to my father's sister, I would call her auntie. So that is matrilineal. How you what names you use with people is matrilineal, but land rights are patrilineal. So it's kind of a weird blending of the two.
So the custom dance is the other place where they use red mats. They use the small red mats as a loincloth for the men and then just wrapped around top and bottom for the women. I'll point out that during this custom dance, I was the only one who actually wore the red mat. All of the rest just used cloth. I called the pansies for it. The other part that goes on while they're dancing is the top two pictures. They do these skits where somebody will dress up as a devil or in drag, and they have these stories that they act out. They're custom stories, which I never managed to get explained very well, but it often involves running the devil out with fire or somebody getting picked up and carried somewhere, and it's all pretty hilarious, kind of like a carnival kind of atmosphere. It's like somebody dressed up as a devil will run in and the crowd will shriek, and then they'll run through the crowd and everybody will jump back.
It's basically slapstick.
Yeah, it's basically slapstick. And then the dancing in Malsisi, there are 11 different areas that come.
I think that the value that we get in Peace Corps is not these sweeping changes. It isn't, I went into a village and then it was better. I improved everything. That's not realistic. Even if that's what I wanted it to be, and even if that was my expectation of myself when I went in, I think that the sweeping changes I had were my friend Wata, who was a bit of a leader and, kind of too shy for it, but he kept being thrust into these leadership roles. And then he and I started working together, and I took him to a glow build, and by the time I left, he was running workshops by himself. That's the kind of change that Peace Corps is really there for. We aren't there to throw a lot of money at something, or to try and build a new hospital. We're there to make these small incremental changes with individuals who will then pass that change forward and be able to better serve their communities and better improve their communities. I think that's what the host country gets out of it. What did I get out of it? Leif and Marcia said it. It's a lifelong experience. It's not something they're ever going to forget.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's a depth that you get from leaving your own culture, from going out of your comfort zone and trying this and doing this. And even if it's maybe not a positive experience all the time, there's still a lot to be learned from it that you can't learn by staying home where it's safe. You learn something by going away and by being forced to confront your own expectations of yourself and confront your own expectations of the culture around you. So I think there's a lot of value in Peace Corps. For me personally, for the American society that gains people with a wider perspective, and for the host country served who gain a wider perspective and a better trained population.
As a congregation, we're very proud of you.
Yeah.